It was something that could have been anticipated, but I mean, it's just trying to anticipate something crazy. I don't know. There's just a lot of things. It's a lot. I can't even start to think about it. Like watching it, you know. So yeah, it's just not in your radar screen, right? And so that's what I worry about. Based on your recent conversations with companies, how does this go totally south? I mean, do you bake in like a worst case scenario? So here's the thing that I think is I'm not sure how it gets untangled is a lot of this is a lot of what you're saying is being driven by lack of financing, lack of investors. You're gonna have more success in order to continue success.
Good conversation going on. If I can have our
ideas saying earlier, it's a function of time. Yeah.
This reminds me of when I was a high school math teacher and none of my students listened. Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. And so we'll call the folks to the front. Senator, I can't do a fireside chat with you if you're not here to chat with. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I think our wonderful crew from John's Grill is coming around taking some breakfast orders, so please let them know what you like. Both options look pretty good. And we'll go ahead and get started. And we'll run true to time, know how busy everyone is. Congratulations if you made it in from the East Coast. That turns out to be the biggest success for the whole event. My name's John Stanford. I'm the Executive Director of Incubate. We're effectively life science venture capital's advocacy arm in Washington. So to any VCs in the room, I'm your lobbyist, whether you know me or not. And we spend our time advocating for public policy solutions that benefit the life sciences community, as well as the patients we all serve. We try to raise awareness, and we could do a little bit better job about how this industry works and some of its complexities. And we're going to talk today about some of the policies that have come about that show fundamental misunderstandings about how our industry works. So thanks everyone for being here. I want to thank members of the press. We have a few of them in the room. Also want to give everyone else a heads up. There are a few members of the press in the room, which is terrific. Because if we sit in rooms like this and talk to each other and bemoan the IRA and bemoan IP protections being weakened, that doesn't do any good. So I want to thank them for taking their time to be here to cover what is one of the more transformative parts of our industry right now. You can talk about cell and gene therapies, you can talk about any class of therapeutics, but if we don't talk about the changing dynamic of the US government's attitude towards this industry, we are missing one of the big drivers of what's causing changes. We'll follow up all the resources we talk about today. We will email everyone after, so I encourage everyone to start their JPM experience with a casual breakfast about policy. So don't feel the need to write down absolutely everything. We're going to circulate materials afterwards. On the table, if I can encourage you to wait till the end, there is a QR code. There's a bit of a call to action here. And so if you can ignore that for the first 40 minutes of the breakfast, I promise we'll explain what it is. And finally, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. 5-6 years ago, when Incubate was founded, we were just at the periphery of JP Morgan. Not a lot of folks wanted to take meetings to understand the impact of policy. We don't buy anything, we don't sell anything. So we weren't of a ton of interest. That really changed, I would say, last year. Kirsten and I have done a lot together. And it's clear that policy is of interest to the folks who come to JP Morgan. And finally, the agenda for today, we're going to have a great fireside chat with Senator Richard Burr. We'll get to that in a second. I'm then going to turn to two pretty learned individuals on some of the impacts policy is having in our environment. And then we're going to use the last 15, 20 minutes for open discussion. I've got some questions for them, but I hope you'll ask as well, or share your insights or your experience. And so with that, we'll jump in. I want to first welcome former Senator Richard Burr, easily one of the most influential policymakers in the healthcare space over the last 4 decades. Most recently, as the senator from North Carolina, which I'm fortunate enough to call home. He oversaw massive transformations at NIH, oversaw the creation of BARDA, major changes at the FDA. His fingerprints are all over those for the last several decades. Now he serves as the chair of DLA Piper's health policy practice. And we are so grateful that DLA Piper partnered with Incubate to put on this breakfast, and I hope this is the first year of many that we can do with DLA Piper. And so I want to start first, Senator, when we talked about doing this event, and we talked about you bringing the perspective of someone who's been approached left and right by this industry, by patient groups, there's 2 things that really stuck out to me. You talked about to have an effective voice in Washington to make good policy, there's 2 real key elements, passion and knowledge. And I wonder if you just expound a little bit on how you see those 2 words having shaped some of the work that you did and why you think they're so meaningful to this conversation.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I've never been accused of being too softly spoken, so I'm going to pass on the mic. John, thank you. And more importantly, I thank DLA Piper and I thank all of you for being here this morning. To say that we're at a pivotal point would be a huge understatement, especially as you're getting ready to have the 2024 elections that will probably look unlike anything we've experienced in life, other than maybe childbirth for some of you. But to understand Washington, you have to have a little bit of historical presence, knowledge, and more importantly, you have to have a little bit of vision, because Congress was set up to be a visionary body. And what we've seen over the most recent history is it shifted from being a visionary body to totally a reactive body, a body that operates in crisis management. And none of us who have been there for decades understood the type of change that would happen from that. Crisis management means that today there's very little curiosity to learn. So with the backdrop of the way the legislative process works means that it has to be bipartisan. You can have a partisan outcome in the House, but when you get to the United States Senate, only once in the 30 years that I was there did one party control 60 votes, which meant that they could ram something through. And so a legislator, member of the Senate, their first thought is, who do I find on the other side that 1, is passionate about this issue, and 2, has the staying power to be there when people start shooting at us. That's why for a decade, my partner was Ted Kennedy. Now, I never went home and told people in North Carolina that. I wouldn't have gotten reelected. But the reality is that members are smart enough to turn and put together the type of relationship that they can get something across the goal line. Today we're in a situation where you've had a tremendous staff drain on the Senate side, which means that people have been promoted from the House to the Senate at a staff level who don't have the institutional knowledge, and it's going to take them 2 or 3 years to get up to speed. And you've got members that are more focused on the politics of Washington. Therefore, there is no passion for a particular issue. And I share this with you not to be critical, but to share with you that for us to actually get policy initiatives done, you have to understand the atmosphere that you're dealing in Washington. And it means that you've got to look for a strategic plan that approaches it from a different angle, where maybe you bypass the knowledge piece and you focus more on the passion piece, and you hope that you can backfill the knowledge as the process goes on. Here are the hard, cold facts though. In 2024, I think it's unlikely that there will be any healthcare legislation of substance that's passed. Primarily because I think it's probably highly unlikely anything will pass in 2024. But if you look at the industry, and one of the reasons that I'm at DLA Piper, I had a choice when I left the United States Senate. I could retire. I've done everything in healthcare I could do. I've been on the Intelligence Committee, House and Senate, as long as then Dianne Feinstein and I were the oldest. I think we've served the most years, 22 years. And then I could watch from the grandstands what's going to happen. And I looked at life science and said, the most exciting time is going to be the next decade. Why would I sit in the grandstands and do it? And I just so happened to find a place where I could merge my Intel background and my healthcare background, which has been extremely helpful in trying to work with clients to come up with a strategic approach to the challenges that Washington offers, which is trying to address knowledge, and more importantly, trying to invigorate passion in people. Legislation, let me just tell you a quick story, and then we'll go next. So I'm a new member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Been there 6 months, 1995. The chairman comes up and he says, Richard, I'd like you to write a piece of legislation to modernize the Food and Drug Administration. God, that's great. I told my colleagues about it and they all laughed at me. And who was going to be my partner? Henry Waxman. Henry, you got to understand, Henry and I had a strained relationship because Henry was anti-tobacco and I came from a tobacco state. It was made up like that. And I accomplished FDAMA in 1997, 2.5 years after I was asked, which meant that we went from one Congress to another Congress, which means you have to start over again. There's the part that people don't realize is passion is when you're willing to carry an initiative from one Congress to the next one, to start over again, and start over again, and start over again. And that is difficult to find that level of commitment by members, and that's why the knowledge piece is so important. They can be passionate because you've got employees in their state. They can be passionate because they know your CEO. But the only place that it goes from one Congress to the next one is because they understand the issue well enough that they're willing to go out and fight for it.
Well, we're going to talk about some of those issues in a second. I want to take a quick poll of our audience. Raise your hand if the U.S. Congress or the administration has done something ever, life science or not, that made you scratch your head and make you wonder, oh, I don't think they really get it. Can I just see a show of hands? So that understanding, I think, is so critical. We are probably the most complex industry that is heavily regulated. And we come with an assumption that the people we send to Washington stumbled across a PhD or an MD on their way into Washington. And we kid ourselves that, and then we get frustrated that they don't understand it. From your time, how did folks, we've got a room of people. If you're in this room, you are a leader in the life sciences community. There's no doubt about that. But I think sometimes folks in rooms like these don't know what gets through to someone like you. What were some of the impactful ways people got you so passionate, which we then benefited from your passion and knowledge? How do people influence you?
Well, let me say, one, members of Congress are entrepreneurs. If they weren't, they wouldn't have done what they did. There's no handbook that says, here's how you run for Congress. At least there didn't used to be. I guess Trump suggests he noticed it pathway. But I think it's important to understand that relationships are everything in the United States Congress. So relationships have to be created from the private sector to some entity, whether it's staff or whether it's members. And contrary to what the national media says, anybody that's elected is not stupid. I mean, there's a capacity there to tap into something that's very valuable. But I think we discount some because we look at them and say, you know, they're really not intelligent. Part of that's because of the profession that they choose. We make an assumption, well, you can't be very bright if you ended up doing this. But these are very talented people. And they can be taught and they can learn. The question is, how do you trigger the curiosity in them to continue to do that? Especially in life science, where it evolves daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. And, you know, your last question today may be what scares you the most, so I'll answer it now. We're headed into a decade that change is going to happen literally as fast as anything in life that happens to us. Just take AI. In 1995, when I went to Congress, my first tough decision was Telecom Act of 1995, where we're going to allow the taxation of the internet. And we made a bipartisan decision that we weren't going to do it because we didn't want to impede what the internet could grow into. We're now 30 years later. Can you tell me when is the internet going to reach maturity? It's not there, because every new technology creates another opportunity for us off the internet. And what it probably tells us about AI is don't do anything to impede what can happen, what this tool could do. Guardrails are fine. We created guardrails with the internet. But make sure that they don't fundamentally change what the capabilities of the technology can potentially do. And I think that what you'll find is you will find members that are willing to go through that knowledge journey with you, as long as there's a relationship.
I want to close, and I'm very grateful that you're going to stick around for the open discussion. Passion and knowledge. Do current policymakers have, that when you look at the Congress, do you feel like they're passionate about this industry? Or do you feel like they're knowledgeable about this industry, or neither? I told you I was bringing the tough questions this morning.
Listen, I'm a realist. Are they passionate about the industry? Yes, I think they are, because every person in America, every family is affected in some way, shape, or form by it. When they look at the political choices of how do I design policy that actually facilitates innovation crossing the goal line? Or do I spend that time trying to get political benefits for reducing the perceived cost of healthcare to them, opening up access to coverage in some way, shape, or form? They're opting for the latter. And that's not to say that I'm not a compassionate person. I am. But I'm also smart enough in the years that I've been involved in life science to understand that if I can present them a cure next year, that's a hell of a lot better than providing them something for free that doesn't cure what they've got. And the longer we push that back, and here again, let me remind you, there's nobody more optimistic about this industry than I am. But as long as you push back the willingness to make sure that our primary goal is innovation, 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 cure, 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 you delay the debate that we have to have in this country, inside the Congress, the American people. Who's going to pay for very expensive treatment? So when we talk about cell and gene therapy, and if you just take sickle cell as an example, since that's now approved, $2.1 million estimate. Well, individuals are going to have a hard time picking it up. Insurers are going to pick it up. Manufacturers certainly not going to pick it up. Governments not in a position to pick it up. we've got to start the conversation amongst all of it as to what shares of this is everybody going to be responsible to take. Because we've got to figure out how to take that innovation, how to take that breakthrough and get it to the person who needs it. And I will tell you, this is just the first of what I believe will be many. And once we can figure out what that template looks like, then everybody's going to know the role that they're going to be expected to play. And government can plan to fill their slot in it, which today, I lied earlier. I said the thing that concerns me the most. This is what concerns me the most. That as we go into 24, actually 25 budget, that as Congress is hungry for revenue, that they will begin to cut some things that we never envisioned, like NIH. Further cuts to places like BARDA. Not fund the new office, the White House Office of Pandemic Prevention and Preparedness. Things that we know we need and that have a great impact on the intellectual property that's coming into life science could change the landscape greatly. So great optimism about what we can accomplish. A real hard understanding that we have a very defined period of time to get this right, or we begin to lose the available capital that exists right now financing innovation in this country.
I think that's actually a great capture of our entire viewpoint. Science can now do incredible things, but policy is getting in the way. Pulling at that knowledge thread, I now want to turn to two people who I consider about as knowledgeable as it gets when it comes to the life science industry, as well as the role of government in it. I've got two folks. I've got Kirsten Axelsen. She's a senior policy advisor at DLA Piper, but she's had a host of roles across industry in over several years, and I've had the opportunity to know you for a good long time, and so I've always considered Kirsten to be one of the best and brightest. She's done a lot of work, not just in the issues we're going to talk about today, but some of it looking at diversifying clinical trials and ways to make the industry operate better. Next to her is Gaurav Gupta, who many of you may know is co-managing partner of Life Science Private Capital, which is the life sciences strategy arm at JPM. I like to think of you as a host for this whole week for all of us. So if you're not happy with your room, if that Uber didn't get there in time,
Call there.
yeah. So I'm really grateful that they took the time to be here. When we sort of teased this event, Incubate's focus this year is in three places: the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and the drug pricing provisions therein, changing dynamics around intellectual property, best represented by the President's announcement last month of a willingness to use margin rights related to price controls. We'll pull at that. And the changing dynamic at the Federal Trade Commission and other agencies as it relates to mergers and acquisitions. And so we're going to pull at each of those threads, maybe fit in a little bit more. But I wanted to start with my question to the two of you, both of you, and Gaurav, we'll start with you on the end. Those three areas, drug pricing provisions of IRA, IP, FTC, can you rank order which is most concerning or most impactful from your standpoint?
Yeah, well, thank you, John, first of all, for putting this together. I think this is an important conversation. It's a privilege to, thank you. I will use this, so I don't have to yell at Kirsten, but thank you for putting this together. I think these are important conversations, and I hope ongoing, because as a senator outlined, there's a lot of work to be done. Clearly, what happens in Washington is as much as we can do on our side to help develop exciting, life-changing medications, and we've had a litany of them that we all know the last just 3 or 4 years alone come to market. Clearly, what happens in Washington is the eye of the needle that we all need to be, I think, much more attentive to based on what's been happening and this sort of mismatch that we're all seeing, as you highlighted, John, things that just make us scratch our head. You know, the way the IRA was constructed with a call out of NDA versus BLA and things that just don't really derive from a rational understanding of industry. So let me get to the heart of your question. So the IRA to me, the way that it was written, it was done without a true deep understanding or stakeholder conversation with real, scientific insight. I think there are a lot of concerning both aspects of the IRA and its implementation, and for what it could portend in the future. So that's top of mind. The FTC, and I think I put that way above the other two parts of the government that have started to weigh in on our industry. So the FTC has had some minor wins in our industry with I think IQVIA abandoning a few takeovers and some others. They've had some other wins in other industries, but by and large, just the data would tell us we just had the biggest M&A year ever in biotech. We're facing the biggest patent cliffs in the history of the biotech industry. There's over 150 billion of annual revenue that's facing LOE by 2030. So I think that the imperative for M&A, which is what sort of drives our industry forward, will override the FTC's personnel, if I may say, problems that they're having now, and the sort of poor results they're seeing when they take cases forward in their decision making. And then, so I put that second and a distant second, and then maybe even a distant third from that is the IP question. At the end of the day, the NIH doesn't typically create pharmaceutical products. So there is clearly valuable IP that is funded by the federal government. And we saw that with, for instance, the mRNA vaccines. But generally, most of the valuable patents in our space are initially, the innovators are biopharmaceutical companies. And so I view those as much more peripheral than the IRA. But Kirsten, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
So Gaurav and I didn't collude, but we both did some form of math for a living, so it's not surprising that we would have ordered these. I would definitely put those in the same ranking. The thing that concerns me more than any of these individual either pieces of legislation or attacks is the overarching negativity towards high-priced drugs, and that to me is what is affecting everything. I'll give an example. The questions around the validity of surrogate endpoints, I don't think are because somebody at CMS questions the amyloid plaque hypothesis, or I don't think it's because somebody at the FDA really wonders whether the endpoints that we're using to approve cancer drugs are actually predicting longer life. We've seen tremendous declines in mortality from cancer and huge 5-year survival rates. It's because there is this reward for slowing down the entry of expensive drugs that is perceived in the public perception. That is what I have a concern about, because that is a much tougher thing for our industry to manage. If you go to the FDA with what you think is a compelling package of evidence, and the whole premise of it is questioned in a way that historically hasn't been seen before, that introduces an element of uncertainty that we really have a hard time preparing for. So as I think about what we do as an industry, what we do as leaders, to me it's really making sure that we have our advocacy lined up around the things that we anticipate might be the next attack on the industry. I think surrogate endpoints are one of them. We should be developing more surrogate endpoints, not less surrogate endpoints. That makes things faster and better for patients. I agree on the IP front. Marching rights, while dangerous and a damaging precedent, really that's going to affect academic institutions and universities. So there I would say be working with our academic institution partners and get them advocating on behalf of the industry. We need to think of different ways to make partners to demonstrate the tremendous promise of science, because that is one thing that I don't think American people are willing to be denied, is the promise of science, because that is continuing to roll on, and we're going to have more drugs developed in the next 5 to 10 years, and we don't have the systems in place to have those drugs approved and made available for the people who need them.
I want to, I'll put on the teacher voice and press on without the mic. I want to come to something, Gaurav, that you mentioned, this DLA NDA. It's something that that Incubate calls the small molecule penalty. And what you were speaking to is 9 years of reward or exclusion from price negotiations, which we consider effectively a price control. 9 years for small molecule products, 13 years from biologics. That's a big difference when you consider that 50% of all drug revenues come in years 10 to 13, and you're taking that off the table. Either of you, what is that real? Are there consequences from an investment standpoint? There's 9 and 13 years different, and then maybe Kirsten, what are some of the effects you see coming out of that? But how real is a loss of 4 years of exclusivity to someone thinking about the financing of a new modality or something?
Well, it's very real. The reality is, all dollars compete in the crucible of the free market, and so we have to be thinking of fundamentally our core business is to buy low and sell high, right? So we need to be underwriting the development of medicines at a lower cost than the NPV that they can subsequently generate at some time point when we can exit that investment. That is the impetus for what has led to the development of many of these exciting new medicines that we've seen, is that someone took that risk to have that bet pay out at some point down the line. So it does matter, because you are taking, as you mentioned, for certain types of medicines, a significant amount of revenue potentially off the table. I don't think, it's there is also, because of where the riskiest capital goes in, it's so early in the development path. It's like, well, if we end up with a top 10 Medicare drug, and we've probably done pretty well in this investment anyway, but I don't think that it's quite that simple. I think it's important because of another point you made earlier. It's head scratching. Why would legislators bias the modality by which we target a certain disease? That almost makes very little sense, and it particularly is detrimental because it affects patients, right? So if you're thinking about, there will be people and companies who just choose to back away from certain types of programs, like small molecule programs, or radiopharmaceuticals are caught up in an FDA program, right? So to say that, I think it's maybe more likely that patients with neurologic disorders and actually cancer disorders, cancer may end up kind of disproportionately affected. Why would that be a policy imperative, right? So I think it is a factor today. I think it will suddenly shift funding into different modalities that may be sort of going down a DLA pathway, but I think it speaks to Kirsten's point. What is coming down the line? If that's something that could get coded into law and passed in a very difficult bipartisan, in a Congress that's struggling to pass much at all, what else could they possibly pass? Because that one just comes from a place that really, I think, has baffled a lot of people in the industry.
Just to add a few points to that, of course I agree. When the 9 years for a small molecule, that's typically more than half of the revenue. It's not like revenues grows at a constant pace, right? Then you have a launch, achieve peak sales, and so you're losing a lot in that last 9 years. There could not have been a worse way to set the prices of drugs. You believe the federal government should have set the price of drugs. There's no credible economist who would say they chose a great way to do it. Right, they chose the most popular drugs, many of whom were already deeply discounted, and then they're going to set the prices below that. So, terrible way to do it. Targeting on the small molecules is an already bad element, and it's going to have consequences. My concern is not so much the drugs not developed, but what this is going to for the incentives this creates. Are we going to see switch strategies towards the end of the life cycles? Are we going to see indications, split into different products? There's going to be a lot of inefficient R&D as a result of this law, because rather than following the science or following patient need, now we've created an extra incentive to follow the reimbursement, which is foolish reimbursement. We should have reimbursement models based on payment for outcomes, payment for value. And here we've got a reimbursement model that's set on an arbitrary date and an arbitrary set of drugs that CMS is picking because they're popular, not because they're bad or wasteful.
John, can I add just one thing in?
Yeah.
Just to, maybe take a shot at Washington. I don't know how many of you remember the show Designated Survivor. It was over a decade ago. You know what the third season of Designated Survivor was about in the Hartman re-election? March in rights.
Really?
Go back and watch it. It's alarming to me that all of a sudden something that was out of a TV show is, I think, what triggered an administration to look and say, here's something that we might be able to launch. And it's to exactly what you said, is we're not focused on the things that allow the debate to happen about reimbursements, debate to happen that about who fuels innovation. And we should really care less about whether the IP came out of NIH or an academic bench. The fact that we got it is what we should be excited about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to maybe anyone, this wasn't on the pre-vetted list, so we're gonna go beyond our globe. The U.S. has built a reputation over the last 4 decades to be the beacon for this industry. There's a reason a lot of folks travel around the world to be here this week. Does anyone see global impacts? You know, folks may not have followed it, but in a pretty stunning reversal on IP policy, the USTR changed the US's position about waiving IP amid the COVID pandemic. That's back on the table to expand that waiver. What are some of the global consequences you see of bad policy at the US level? Is it everyone's gonna have bad policy, so we'll keep our leadership here? Or are other people getting smarter about this and catching your eyes as possible future hubs of innovation to some extent?
I can speculate. Well, I mean, the one that comes to mind, John, is China. So, you know, we are on almost every front of economic development, some kind of stalemate or Cold War with China, and I'll leave that out of this discussion. But, you know, China very clearly since about, you know, kind of 5 to 10 years ago, made life sciences a core strategic pillar of their top-down economic plan. And from about 2016 to 2021, we saw a tremendous sort of boom in the Chinese biotech ecosystem. You know, in 2016, the aggregate market cap of all Chinese biotech companies was $1 billion. In 2021, it was $250 billion. So that boom has since been followed by a significant bust and a little bit of a policy retread. But we're now seeing embers of that coming back. And so I think that, you know, to your point, you know, if anything you do, we like to think science is relentless, right? There is between the ability of you know, academic institutions to share data seamlessly and collaborate across the Pacific, you know, multiple scholars going back and forth, it seems likely that you know, Chinese institutions and academic researchers and pharmaceutical companies will continue to make every effort they can to catch up. In the next few years, we're already seeing the pharma industry shift its view eastward as they look for assets and new medicines. We're seeing a lot of deal making happening in China, which I think predicates that, you know, on the Chinese equity markets, we'll see more value appreciation from the wreckage of today. So yeah, I do think that we should be conscious of the specter of sort of pushing some innovation to China. You know, we've now had the first ever FDA-approved drug that was developed by a Chinese biotech company. That was in 2019. There's definitely more to come. The other areas of the world that I think have an ambition but are much more nascent, I think that the Gulf countries have a very strong ambition. They're spending a lot of time investing in the space, getting smart in the space, reforming their regulatory space, making it attractive for biotechnology companies. They are significant payers. They don't balk at paying $2 to $5 million for curative therapies, which I think is significant. So, you know, that they're not, I think, ready to step into a global tier yet. But at the end of the day, you know, Teva, which is an Israeli company, was a major global player. So it's conceivable that one day that there will be, you know, the ability of that region to siphon talent and resources as well. I don't know.
You know, to add to the point on China, the Chinese government has invested more in R&D, as our government has peeled back on R&D investment. They established an intellectual property system that in many ways exceeds some of the protections you have in the US, where we're talking about eroding our intellectual property. There's already stronger intellectual property protections in Europe on biopharmaceuticals. And the longest, most time-consuming part of our clinical development process, enrolling in clinical trials, is done much more quickly in China. And countries around the world are developing clinical trial capabilities, including Eastern Europe, and as you mentioned, the Gulf. So I do think that we are going to start to see medicines coming out of other countries, and they're going to be good. There's going to be good science behind them. And again, I go back to my point, the US consumer is not going to want to be denied those medicines. So despite maybe some skepticism around should we be approving drugs that are based on foreign data, people, especially in diseases like oncology, where there's a high mortality, are going to want to have access to those drugs. So our consumers won't be denied, and it's going to be even more competitive landscape for global drug development in the future.
As the caffeine settles into your body, perhaps what looks like pretty delicious steak also settles into your body. Opening it up for questions. So if you have a question, and we've already got one, so be thinking of some. And yeah, we'll start right here. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself before you ask.
Yeah, my name is Rahul Saikia. I head M&A for Rising Pharmaceuticals. So we are backed by private equity HIG Capital to consolidate kind of US manufacturing assets, and a lot of Chapter 7 and Chapter 11 will happen. We feel personally that there has to be some level of biosecurity in this country, economics aside. So my question on the policy side is around, I know we spoke a lot about small molecules were mentioned, but innovation aside, just the existing medicines, the affordability of it, and the sustainability of supply, right? So if I think of policy from my vantage points, like what comes into the plant, and what goes out of the plant on the commercial side. Into the plant, APIs, no one complains. It's like, economics, and if there are many suppliers, there are many buyers. In the plant itself, we understand that, kind of cost of labor, cost of running the, plants are high in the US, but you don't outsource your entire defense budget, right? You have to have biosecurity, and I don't feel that we have, enough of the US government doing that. That's number one. And on the commercial side, see, it's like this, right? You started the talksman saying that people should get kind of affordable medicine, which is right, but then you have three buyers who are big buyers who kind of control the buying to an extent that it becomes counterintuitive, or for people to stop producing a lot of essential medicine. We see drug shortages. I don't see any kind of intervention there. The third piece is, see, on the FTC side, and we see like a Horizon engine going through, but if I try to merge two generic companies, 2-3 molecules overlap, and we may be like, one of the 25 in the market, we have to go to the same process, pay the same dollars to DLA to get our, to get us past FTC. So I think, so those are my questions. Do the US government recognize this? Price goes like this, but those demand for these medicines is not going anywhere. I just don't feel that there's enough of a conversation around this versus innovation, CRISPR, inflation reduction, all of that.
Well, let me just address the supply chain. We're in a realignment of the supply chain for the West. I can't tell you at the end of the day exactly what it looks like, but it's really motivated by more than life science, without getting real specific. And at the end of the day, I think there will be a total realignment of the supply chain. And companies will look at China from a standpoint of domestic production there, but not from a standpoint of global integration. I just can't tell you what that timeline is, but the last 12 months, it has accelerated.
I think it makes it good. So we picked a few issues, but you brought up several there that I just want to recapture for everyone. Shortages in supply chain. The issues we kind of earlier talked about are vacuum issues. They affect life sciences almost exclusively. We didn't even scratch the surface on issues that affect the whole economy or the sort of the global trade atmosphere, where you better believe, to the senator's point, when some of his former colleagues are looking to raise money, our industry has a big target on its back. And it's not that $50 billion to remove lead from our pipes is a bad idea. It's not that we don't need digital broadband to reach every American. But everyone should know that our industry is thought of as the wallet that can pay for all of that. And that bleeds into, if we do have unique supply chain issues, no one really hearing us out. And so as I think about your question about shortages, as we onshore more for that biosecurity, it's one of those paradoxes. The same people who pushed for the Inflation Reduction Act, who would love to bleed as much out of this industry as possible, are also the same people saying, We want more onshored manufacturing.
Yeah.
We want diversity in clinical trials, which is a laudable and critical goal. But they also think they can do that while $300 billion is taken out of this industry. And I don't know, and maybe Kirsten, to you, what are some of the other consequences? We focused on the IRA price negotiation. You're a leader on IRA across the board. What are some other consequences you see happening? And then I don't want to lose sight of, you raised something that we care deeply about, PBM reform, and we'll get back to that. And then these new HSR guidelines out of FTC and DOJ, right?
Yeah, just to take the Inflation Reduction Act, I think there's been a misconception that the Inflation Reduction Act affects 10, 15, 20 drugs. The Inflation Reduction Act affects every single drug, and it affects doctors and hospitals. The reason I say that is not only is it that the prices of certain drugs are going to be set by the federal government, a huge number of rebate dollars are going to be disappearing from the plans, right? The net prices are going to end up somewhere a little below where they are now, maybe a lot below where they are now. But instead of the plans getting those rebate dollars, using them to run premiums, using them to attract patients, the federal government's getting those rebate dollars. And when the plans, in particular the standalone drug plans, lose those rebate dollars, they're going to be very squeezed on their profitability, and many of them are going to exit the market. We're going to see more consolidation in the health plan side. We're going to see more movement into Medicare Advantage plans, which is integrated care delivery. In some ways, is can be better for patients, but also creates more market power for those plans. So that's going to be more pressure on the doctors, more leverage for them to be able to get lower rates from the doctors and from the hospitals. And also, it costs the federal government more money to have somebody in a Medicare Advantage plan. So here's this desire to really stick it to the drug companies and bring down the drug prices, and what it's going to do is have an effect on the entire healthcare system. In the most expensive part of the U.S. healthcare system, which is Medicare Advantage. It also happens to be 5 times as profitable to have somebody in a Medicare Advantage plan versus employer plan versus Medicaid. So it's going to really have an effect on the plan dynamics, and that goes well beyond drugs.
Yeah.
Hi, Greg Slovakian with Biospace. We're a publication that serves the industry. This isn't on the legal front regarding IRA. I mean, there were all these legal challenges that are ongoing to the law. Do you see in 2024 any of them making headway, or are we pretty much in the implementation phase of the law?
I don't believe we have a single attorney. So I want to, I'll preface that that I'm certainly not an attorney, and Incubate hasn't filed any amicus briefs or anything like that, but we're watching the cases closely. I think it depends on the court. I do think some courts may find merit. The only place where we've weighed in was the DOJ did respond to one of the cases in Ohio saying there aren't consequences yet, and so it's not right. We fundamentally disagree with that. We have something called the Life Sciences Investment Tracker that looks at where we view dollars flowing at the VC level, at the private equity level, and beyond. We also track all the filings and earnings reports, and you are seeing dollars move away. Take the small molecule penalty, for example. We are seeing some folks say, we're shuttering this. Well, the patients who were sitting out hoping for something, Alnylam shut down a phase 3 trial, which was pretty far along to shut down. There are consequences to that are directly attributable to that. And so the only place where I hope the DOJ will see some merit, or at least the court system, is that there are consequences now. We don't have to wait for the announced price, which we'll get in September, and will go into effect in 2026. We don't have to wait for that. Industry will react, and already is reacting, and it's not always going to be to the benefit of patients because of some of the economic choices that they are forced to make by this law. I can't speak to the outlook of the cases. I don't know if either of you want.
I don't know that I have enough expertise to speak to them, but it seems unlikely, just given the time
Yeah,
where we are in the cycle.
and so actually timely this week. It's our understanding all the way up to about February 1st. Companies that have been selected for negotiation will receive their first offer from the federal government. We expect probably 10 out of 10 to not accept that offer and issue a counter offer. That'll play out until September, when the public new price will be released. And I'll say from our perspective, and Senator, maybe you have a thought on this, there's a lot of discussion. I saw one analyst post what they thought the cuts might look like, something like 25% off of list price. If you look at the amount of money the IRA seeks to raise here, or the political pressure, and that these can't be small cuts. And in an election, these prices will be announced in September of a presidential election year. I would be hard pressed to imagine the Biden administration announcing fairly meager cuts to the named prices. So I think we will see draconian cuts, and I think the political pressures will drive some of that. And so I think we're all going to be pretty stunned in September if you're going into this saying this isn't going to be a substantial cut to the list price of those drugs. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I mean, mathematically, it can't be 25% off the list price. 80% of non-FAMP, which is the formula, is closer to 50% off of the list price. And also, you know, you can look at observable data like Sector and Sovereign does, net price analysis. The ceiling for some of these drugs, they're already deeply discounted. They're already offering 60 or 70% discounts. So it has to be at least that. So no, there's no way. There's no way. I like to think in this first round, CMS might be closer to the ceiling, but that's just optimistic. And let's also remember there's cancer drugs, there's, you know, which is a protected class. It's going to be the price cuts, but then it's also going to be what's going to be the formulary access. There's nothing stopping the plans from putting prior authorization, step edits in front of these drugs. Because remember, plans like drugs with high prices and big rebates. These drugs are not going to have rebates. And they're going to be hard pressed to figure out how to make up the rebate dollars. So we cannot pretend that we're going to see a huge benefit to patients from these price cuts.
From a political standpoint, is any price too low?
Well, the administration is going to have to make sure that whatever the OMB projected savings of this actually balances. So, the strange thing about Washington is that we're driven by either, if you're in the executive branch, by OMB, or CBO if you're in the legislative branch, and however they score the savings or the cost. And we never have seen CBO or OMB provide benefits to value in healthcare, but we have seen them be punitive from a standpoint of the savings that can be accomplished. That's why typically an initiative is going to do twice as much harm, because they're never going to get the full impact of the dollars, so they got to go overboard. And that's where I think we're going to land.
Probably have time for one more question. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, I'm Brenda. I'm with the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives. We're able to lobby the government to support legislation policies around longevity and neuroscience. And I think it's a critical time for us to be around because we're seeing a lot of pharma companies investing in down bio-age and bio. And recently we're preparing for our first briefing in DC. It was supposed to be this month, but as you know, congressional calendars change. And it is an election year, so it's been tough for us to plan. But it's now set to be in March this year. And I just wanted to ask if you all had any advice as you're planning this. We have a longevity science caucus. We have California, Texas, New York, and Florida engaged. And yeah, just any advice as we're trying to engage the congressional staff and members about this new field that is lost.
Well, terrific that you're doing that. We're actually going to close with a pitch to all of you about taking action, because if you haven't taken away from this that it's pretty dire from a policy standpoint. This is not the feel-good story part of JP Morgan. Happy to also sidebar in great detail, because we do a lot of briefings and share what we think are best practices. But I would certainly start with, I think some of the lessons we took out of IRA, make no assumptions. And this goes to the knowledge point that the senator raised. They won't know what longevity is. They won't know how that ties to any benefits. And so I think one of the mistakes I get asked a lot, why 9 and 13? Where'd that come from? It came from people not understanding that we have patent terms and we also have market exclusivities, and that they work dynamically together. The drafters of the legislation didn't understand that. We made the assumption, unfortunately, that they did. And so we jumped past 101 in our discussions and got to 201. Make sure, I would say, that you start at 101, because to the senator's point, the literacy rate is so low. Because people change, and people change jobs, you get new folks. We'll cut that part of the clip out. So yeah, we'd love to talk about that. Have data. I think data is critically important. But also don't forget the patient. And we do that sometimes. And I think when you look at the headlines coming out of this week, you won't see the word patient too many times. And we have to go back to when a new drug gets approved, there is someone who takes it and feels better. And we lost that thread a little bit. And so I would make sure you connect it to real people, because that's what's gonna move someone like the senator.
Yeah, let me just say this, that this is not about quantity. Your goal may be to educate 40 people, 40 members. If none of them are passionate, where'd you get to? So the goal should be, how many passionate offices can we engage with? People that are willing to go back and take this as an initiative where we can build on it to get to others. In a lot of cases, that's gonna come not on the committee of jurisdiction, it may come off of the committee of jurisdiction. Because committee of jurisdiction sort of sits there and waits for the chairman or the ranking member to say what policies they should be out talking about. And the second thing I would tell you is just be very flexible. I'm not sure that you can have those meetings when Congress is not in session. They might not come to a budget agreement in January, but they're gonna have another shot at getting it wrong in February, and you could go into March with a government shutdown, and I've been through about 20 some of them, nobody wins.
I think if there's a population that cares about their own longevity, I think Congress is a pretty good place to start. There are some people who probably want another 20 or 30 years around up there. We'll close it. That's it. We'd also love to chat with you and think about how we can be helpful in that. And we'll close first with a call to action. Incubate, I want to be clear, not a product of DLA Piper or JP Morgan. But Incubate has drafted an open letter, and if you scan that QR code, it'll take you to an opportunity to sign up, and we hope it'll be folks in this room and folks from around this week at JP Morgan saying, hey, we care about policy, and we want both the Biden administration and members of Congress. So if you'll consider adding your name to that. Too often, folks in this room and the rooms around town have hid behind organizations that do all the advocacy in Washington, and that doesn't work anymore. Those organizations, Incubate included, do a lot of the heavy lifting, but we need the names of individual leaders in this space to really contribute. And so that's one opportunity to get involved. There are many others. Incubate's happy to set you up with a meeting with your congressman or congresswoman. We're happy to help you think about how you write an op-ed. And of course, we want to stay in touch with you. We're going to circulate a couple materials, one of which, BioCentury had a great piece, and typically that's behind the paywall, but they were kind enough to allow attendees of this breakfast. That's an outlook on policy, all the things we talked about in greater detail, and we'll send that around. With that, I want to thank DLA Piper for being a wonderful co-host here. I want to thank our incredible service team that made this morning so enjoyable, and our terrific panelists. And with that, we'll wrap, and thank you everyone finally for coming, and hopefully this is a great start to a really incredible week. So join me in thanking everybody.
And if
Where are you from?
From North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm with a global technology company. So digital transformation, life sciences innovation, operationalizing of their digital strategies, implementation of software, building software, all the good stuff that makes modern organizations